Voiceover is everywhere, and you hear it every day. From radio
Number one for New Country 96.3 Hawkeye in the morning.
to TV
My name is Lady Whistledown. You do not know me, but I know you.
to movies.
My name is Optimus Prime. Autobots, roll out!
To animation
I am vengeance. I am the night. I am Batman.
and so much more. Welcome to episode 8.
Welcome to Who Did That Voice, the show where we take an in-depth look at the world of voiceover, including movies, TV, animation, and more. And now, here's your host, Trenton Larkin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Who Did That Voice. Today, I am super excited to be bringing you an interview with an elusive man who's been hard to nail down, Michael Scott. Michael, welcome to the show, bud.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hey, it is awesome to have you on the show, Michael. We've, known each other via online for about 5 or so years now. And, initially when my podcast launched, I started meeting the VO world, and you were one of those individuals I got to meet, which was so awesome. And your career has blossomed and bloomed since the original launch of Who Did That Voice. So I'm so excited to finally snag some of your valuable time to chat with you today, bud.
Thank you so much for having me. I love your show, which is why I really wanted to do it. I listened when I was brand new in voiceover, and I learned so much about the history and different people's techniques and what was going through their minds. So I'm thankful for you doing this show because it really helped define my career. And obviously, I still have a long way to go, but I do want to share that with you. Your show. I listen to it on long drives or, traveling or whatever, but I've probably gotten through most, if not all, the episodes.
That's amazing. Wow, dude, I'm super honored. I had no idea. Yeah. Well,
my favorite are your X-Men ones. I'll just say that real quick. Like hearing my childhood heroes, explain how they did the voices for, characters like Wolverine was like extremely exciting for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's amazing to hear that story from you. I had no idea you were going to spring that on me. But, that's the whole reason I created the show in the first place, was to inspire, motivate, and educate people. And to hear that story from you is fascinating. I've started hearing stories more and more like that from people over the years because they've discovered it even after the show had kind of been on a hiatus for a while and, said, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. And I learned something new. And, it's just so cool to know that I'm sharing something that people don't know. And I love to teach, and I love that I'm an educator in a form, not just sharing a passion and a geek thing that I love and I'm a nerd about, but something that can really educate people, whether they just want to learn something new or if it, like you, has helped, teach you something new or help you think about something differently to help grow your own VO career, which is part of the whole reason this show exists. So that's awesome. Very cool, man.
Thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome, Michael. I'm so glad I was able to grab you. And before we actually started the interview, Michael kind of shared with me some things have transitioned in his life. He's gotten talent agents that have helped him do everything from behind the mic to in front of the camera and beyond. So his career has extremely grown and will keep growing. We'll try to have him back on the show here again sometime in the near future, as his career has lots of growth potential that he unfortunately can't share with us due to NDAs. But those are non-disclosure agreements for those who aren't familiar with the terms. But Michael will be back with us before you know it to share more adventures. But let's dive into the adventures of today before we go into the future. So Michael, you know the drill. You know how this show works. Tell us the story of little Michael Scott, the boy that grew into the man he is today, and how did he become a voice actor?
So for me, I guess I'll categorize it in different areas because in my life, I've been fortunate to get different life experiences in different industries.
Yeah.
But from the beginning, we laughed about X-Men. I grew up playing with toys, and that was really watching Saturday morning cartoons, when that was actually a thing, and playing with my Ninja Turtles and then my Batman toys and then my X-Men toys really shaped my life because, you had to do the different voices for the different turtles. You had to do the different voices for the X-Men, especially if you played with your friends. So that's kind of how I got into voiceover from the initial stages, was just watching cartoons and mimicking those. And as I mentioned, X-Men being one of my favorites, I would just imitate the voices I would see through the different shows. I'd be heroes, I'd be villains, whatever popped up, I would practice those. And that's what really gave me a love for the art and for the craft. And then I'll kind of flash forward to later in life. My love for superheroes led me to join the United States military because I wanted to help. I wanted to give back. I wanted to find a way to be as close as I could to being a superhero as possible. And I thought for me, that was being a soldier, being a military police officer. And, I had a 20-year military career doing those things. But along that journey, I also discovered that law enforcement is reactive. And what I mean by that is, you do something wrong, Trent, and I got to put handcuffs on you, right?
Yeah.
But as an educator, I can help you before you need the handcuffs, and it's more proactive.
Yeah.
So I went back to college and, got degrees in history, philosophy, criminal law, education, got master's degrees, teaching credentials, all these things. And I became an educator, first in the high school and then in college. And I love it because as an educator, you help people before they need the handcuffs. And that gave me peace in life. And I've always been into acting. And, ever since I was a kid doing little plays in elementary school, middle school, high school, I starred in musical theater shows and things like that. The Infante family, I did musicals and shows with, and they really grew that part of me that wanted to be an artist. But I was always a realist. So, I did military and I did education and I did all these other jobs. I worked in the insurance industry because I wanted stability, but a part of me always loved the arts. And so to shorten the story, what changed my life was my aunt was auditioning for a show called Who Wants to Be a Superhero? And if you're not familiar with the show, it was Stan Lee created it. And if you're not familiar with Stan Lee, you probably are not listening to this show, right? So for Who Wants to Be a Superhero, I helped worked with my aunt to create a superhero character. It is so funny because when she first told me about it, she's like, there's a show for this guy named Stan Lee. He does comic books. I'm like, do you mean Stan Lee? She's like, yeah, I think that's who he is. And I'm like, okay, so do you realize he created the X-Men and Spider-Man and all the Marvel characters your son loves? And so she had no idea. And it was really cool because, I worked with her to collaborate and kind of create her character. And to make a long story short, she took me with her to Comic-Con because her character got on the show and did really well. And I got to meet Stan Lee and, share all this my love for comics and things. And he actually remembered me. And then she would get to go year after year. So he would have these really cool sci-fi parties and I would get invited because of that connection.
Wow.
And what was really cool is at one of these events, I was there with my friend Philip, who also works as a costume designer at Comic-Con for all the Marvel movies. We were childhood friends. But basically, I met an agent who changed my life. And her name is Alyssa Gentile. In case she ever listens to this, she single-handedly is the reason I'm in voiceover. So I met her at the event, and we were just talking just like normal. I wasn't like, hey, I'm a actor, and I'm trying to be an actor, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
We were just being people, just talking, laughing, having a good time at this event. And, it eventually gets to, oh, what industry are you in? What are you doing? And she said, I'm a voiceover agent. And immediately I was like, my jaw dropped, and I was like, oh my God, I've been looking for you all my life. She's like, what, really? And I was like, yeah, I've always wanted to do that, but I had no idea how. And Alyssa is such a kind, generous person. She said, well, here's my card, let me know if you have any questions. And I said, okay, when are you available? This was, Comic-Con, maybe Saturday or so.
Yeah.
She's like, I'll be back in the office, Monday afternoon. And I was like, can I call you then? She's like, yes. Okay. 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock, I call her. And I picked her brain for everything. And she was so generous with the knowledge, which is why I always try to give back, because Alyssa guided me through everything from, what classes should I take? She said, try Kalmanson and Kalmanson. So I went there and I took all the classes there and they were great. And I got to be in studio and learn mic technique and things like that. And then I'd send her a picture or a text like, okay, I went to Accountants and what's next? And she'd be like, okay, so it'd be helpful to network. So she introduced me to the voiceover community. And so then I'd send her pictures from those events like, all right, I met these people. What's next? And then she's like, okay, well, you need a microphone. Well, what microphone do I need to get? She's like, this is what you need to get. So then I send her a picture. I got the microphone. What's next? And so she's like, next, you need a demo. So I'm like, okay, who should I go? So she sent me like a list of 3 people in the industry. And then I kind of vetted them, researched it. And then I made a demo. Then I sent her a demo. She's like, this is really good, but you need to make these changes. I was like, say no more. And I made the changes. So she was really, really a great mentor and a friend to guide me through the industry, those things that we just don't know if you don't have someone helping you out with that stuff. And, she sent me auditions to practice with, and I'm using air quotes, not that you can see them if it's a podcast. But I got really good at the practice auditions to the point where I eventually got signed by Vox Inc. in LA. And, they're a great, amazing agency. And Alyssa's since moved on, and, she was an associate producer and now a producer at Riot Games. So she's doing great, amazing things. But before she left that legacy with me to help me start my career. And I am forever grateful to her and owe her everything.
Man, that's a pretty amazing story. And you got such a firsthand experience with her guiding you through the process. That's amazing. That's really awesome.
Absolutely.
First, let's dive into some of the other VO that you have done. I know some of the stuff you've done has been for video games like Monster Hunters, League of Legends, Battlefield 2042, Resident Evil 8. I'm a big gamer myself, so whenever I get to connect with actors, it's always special to me to get to know people better and to share those stories with other people, because it makes that medium so much more impactful when you know that actor on a more personal level.
Sure. I will dive into some of it. Some of it I can't say too much because of
I understand,
NDA, like you talked about. But Monster Hunters I'll start with because that game is already out, and it was one of my first opportunities to be a playable character. And for those that don't know, in video games, of course, you have cinematics where it's like, a little mini movie and they show you certain things. But to be the playable character, you're that guy like the whole entire game. And that was a really fun experience. So with Monster Hunters, like many games today, you can customize your character, change the skin tone, make them a human, make them a creature, whatever it is you want to dress them like. And so I got to be a playable character. So it doesn't really have a name, right? Because he's like the playable character. Like he can be whatever you want him to be. But it's really cool. It takes maybe about a week or two to lay it down. And it's interesting because you're always doing efforts. So efforts in the industry are like the sounds that go with whatever the game is, So it's like climbing the ladder efforts and falling down efforts and swinging sword efforts, getting shot, getting stabbed, shooting people, stabbing people, whatever the efforts are. So you're spending a lot of time dying, in all honesty. That's usually what you're doing mostly. And then, just giving sounds. And I won't do too many because I don't want to be all loud in the mic. But basically, you're basically fighting yourself in a room for hours. And I think for aspiring voice actors, one of the things I learned is that, you kind of envision what you're doing. And I actually physically do it. Like I have little props in my studio, like little baby guns, little baby swords and things. So when I'm swashbuckling, I'm really doing it in real life. And, with efforts, you make a different sound as you go, like ooh, ee, whatever it is. And it's a really fun job when you break it down that you're basically getting paid to like bring these characters to life. So
That's
Monster
so cool.
Hunters was a really great experience. So that one I got to be the hero, something like Resident Evil I'll talk about because that one's already out. Resident Evil, The Village. I'm a bunch of ghouls and goblins, drill man. So that one's cool because you do creature voices. So you don't actually talk. You're just, making different gushy, cozy zombie sounds to attack people. So there's different levels of different games. And then, of course, when you're doing the cinematic stuff, that's when you're more actually acting and really diving into deep copy of scripts. And there's back and forth. The challenge of voiceovers, of course, you're usually acting alone in a booth, but you're still trying to connect, whether it's with that other character or with the audience. And as we say, you're always talking to one person. But as you know, millions of people might play the game. And then I've gotten opportunities to play villains in different characters throughout different things where Trials of Mana, if you play that game, I'm in that game and I'm a couple of different characters. So it's been a cool opportunity to play heroes and villains. And then I have a really big military game coming out soon, which I can't say too much, of course, because of NDA. But being able to play a soldier after being a soldier in real life is really rewarding because I get to bring that real life experience. And I think there's value in that because most people who've never been in the military, you know, they only know the military through TV and movies and things like that. And so whenever I get a military script, you know, I'll usually always give them one take as written, and then I'll give them a second take how we would really say it in the military. And for that, that's been really successful with booking in that genre of, you know, military style shooters. So, you know, more on that on our next episode. But I've been really fortunate in booking some big military roles.
That's very, very cool. And I can't wait to discuss those further as you're able to. But we definitely want to protect those NDAs for sure.
Yes.
You know, something that came to mind, Michael, is I know you've done motion capture, and I've talked about that in the past with people, but something that came to mind that I had never thought of is when you're doing mocap, motion capture, it's also called mocap for those who don't know that. Do y'all actually record the audio while doing the mocap, or do you do it after, or sometimes you do or don't? Or
it depends because sometimes they want a clean take, but essentially when you're doing mocap, like my jobs have been, again, to protect the NDA kind of military movement things. So you're actually saying it, you're doing it full speed, but you know, just like anything, sometimes they're pickups and they might have you record some of the audio separate and then obviously do the mocap on screen. So it honestly depends, but for the most part, it's your full performance because you're mic'd up, you know, you got this little suit on, you've got cameras all over the place. So everything is live.
That's awesome. Yeah. So it goes beyond just the voiceover aspect because you're physically acting out those scenes, which that's pretty cool, you know, and I know some people are familiar with mocap, but I was like, I don't know, you know, I was like, I know you see actors acting out the lines, but I never really thought, do they capture that audio live or do they go back and record it in a booth and then add it? But that's really cool and fascinating to know.
Yeah. And the cool part is, or the challenge for some voice actors is you do have to learn your lines. And as you know, with voiceover, your script is always in front of you, you know, in front of the booth, but you do have to learn your lines for most mocap jobs because you're off book. So you're doing blocking. So if you've ever done any stage work or anything like that, that helps you because you've got to move. You know, you're moving your face, moving your body because it captures everything. But for those who's not as familiar with it, that's how you get characters that don't exist in real life, like the Incredible Hulk and the Marvel and Avengers movies. Like obviously, no one's really that size or Thanos. So not that I've been lucky enough to play any of those huge characters, but that's kind of the industry is how to create those amazing characters in real life.
No, but those were great examples of, you know, like characters that have an unrealistic, you know, size or dimension that, you know, that helps with the mocap to be able to create that, which is pretty cool. So, you know, for people who have listened to my show, like Michael growing up on Who Did That Voice, you know, it's all about acting because, you know, you never know when you're going to get an opportunity to do something where you're not just behind the mic and you've got to be able to act and express. And so there's so much more than just using your voice to it, isn't there?
Absolutely. It's all of you. The other things I've been really fortunate to do is voice match, which I didn't know I had that skill, but
so cool.
That's how I got in the union. And it was an awesome project that was directed by Robert Zemeckis called The Witches. And, you know, for those not familiar, Robert Zemeckis is the director of Back to the Future, of Forrest Gump, of, you know, tons of huge A-list Hollywood movies. And my agent got me an audition for him. And the story was kind of sad at first because for those not familiar with the way the union works, you can only do union work if you're in the union, but you can only get in the union if you do union work. So our industry is this crazy system. So the only way around it is this thing called a Taft-Hartley, or basically someone is willing to hire you and kind of bypass the fact that you're not in the union yet. So for me, that was Robert Zemeckis, and it was a huge opportunity to work on a major motion picture with one of the biggest directors of our time. And, he basically chose me because I was able to do the voice of this character, and that's how I got in the union. And so
That's so cool.
It was life-changing, And
Yeah.
and when I say he directed me, it was like a one-on-one session. And this
Oh,
guy is
wow.
like Mozart in the studio. He'll like close his eyes and he like waves his hands like a conductor, if you can imagine it. And he hears what you say and he's like, try it a little bit like this or try it a little bit like that. Not to get too specific, but it's just like the way he directed me, I was just like in awe, like, oh, okay. Anything you say. Like it was like
That's so
magic,
awesome.
But that was how I got into the union. And so I'm very grateful for that opportunity and many that followed. What happens sometime in our industry, for those that don't know, is that celebrities are really busy because they're celebrities. And so sometimes they are unavailable to do some of their ADR or their voice work after. You were just talking about the mocap. Sometimes you make a movie or whatever and you don't get clean, clear sound. So it has to be redone later, and then the voice is put into the movie or the film or whatever it is. And so there's a niche work in voiceover. If you're really good at voice matching people, a friend of mine, John, known as Epic Voice Guy, is probably like the best at this. And, he basically impersonates celebrities all the time. So if you're really good at that, there is work for you, because a lot of times the Hollywood star will do the movie, right? Like Boss Baby is a great example. And the TV show on Netflix is not typically voiced by the cast that you have in the actual film.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky enough to work on that project as well, doing voice match. So I tell that story to just inspire people that sometimes, even if you can't be the star, you could at least pretend to be the star.
That's so awesome. Now, but in those kind of cases, when you're doing the ADR, do you get the credit or does it go to the star?
So that is a good question. So we're not allowed to say specifics, which is what I haven't done. For that very same reason.
See, and
so
I
I'm
wasn't
actually
sure
glad
because
you
I was
asked.
like, you've said, hey, I've done these things, but I'm like, so what is it? But I was like, I'm pretty sure that's something you unfortunately can't tell us. And I was thinking that, but
you can't. It sucks. So here's the one of the important parts. You still get the paycheck. You still get the money for doing the job. And you will get credit. It's just credited typically differently. Like, it won't say, for example, Michael Scott as this main
Mark
character.
Hamill.
It'll say
whatever, yeah.
Right. It'll say Michael Scott additional voices or ADR or looping, things like we do in our industry where we fill in voices for people. So you might be, doing a huge character, a huge celebrity, a very recognizable voice, but you can't say it. And you don't do it because you don't want to get blacklisted, right? Where you're like, that guy who's like telling all the Hollywood secrets, and I'm way too new in my career. If I was Denzel Washington, I'd say whatever I want, but I'm just Michael Scott trying to make it. So, I don't want to get my wrist slapped. It's funny. I talked to my agent, Michaela Hicks, right before this is airing.
Yeah.
And I asked her about that very same thing. And she's like, yeah, it's better to be careful. So I was like, all right, I always follow good advice because I don't want to end my career before it begins.
Oh, I understand.
I'll just say it like this. There are opportunities to match celebrity voices, and you may not get fully credited, but you'll still get paid and you'll still get the experience, and it still gives you an opportunity to work doing something you love.
That's awesome. Well, and Michael, I legitimately didn't know that. So it's crazy that even after doing as many episodes as I've done, over 130 episodes, I'm still learning stuff every day. So, it's like,
that's
it's crazy.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah,
so
crazy.
There, I shared something original.
That's
a big deal because you've done a lot of shows.
Yeah, I mean, I have, but it's like, I know there's the ADR, which is the audio dialogue replacement, right? Isn't that what it stands for?
Yes.
Okay. So we've talked about ADR, we've talked about mocap, we've talked about some voiceover, but there's still different avenues to each of those. Like when I've seen those actors that say additional voices, I had no clue that meant they could have been voicing the main character, but you have no idea because they're not credited as voicing, the Mask or whatever the character is, Jim Carrey, whoever, so
right.
That's crazy.
Yes.
But, anyway, that's, you learn something new every day. That's
hey,
the
I'm happy to share that.
That's amazing, man. I appreciate it.
It sucks to have to be somewhat vague in your career, but that's okay because, sometimes you just got to follow the rules and play the game or you get kicked out of the arena.
There was something I was Googling the other day, and it was with you, and I can't remember the name of the program, but I wanted to talk about it. You served our country, but you also served our young people. They were young kids that I believe had dropped out of high school.
Oh, yes.
And you were helping them through a program. What was that about? Tell us a little bit about it, because it was really amazing. The bit I got to watch online was amazing, and I just wanted to share it with people.
Absolutely. So the program is called Sunburst Youth Academy, and the mission is to intervene and reclaim the lives of 16 to 18-year-old high school dropouts and help them become productive citizens in the community. So in short, it's a military-style high school that I had the fortune of helping create from the very beginning. And I was the commandant, which is, the program supervisor, dean of students.
Yeah.
And we brought students in there are programs like this all over the country. So Challenge is the national organization. And I believe there are about 37 programs around the country. But why these programs are special is they take the student away from whatever it was that was the issue. So some of them have issues with gangs or with drugs or with abuse or neglect. And they come with a wide variety of issues, which is why the term at-risk youth. But for whatever reason, they weren't going to graduate high school. So our programs take them out of that environment. They live on typically military bases. And obviously, there's no war fighting piece of it. So we take what works from the military, the discipline, the structure, the regimentation. They're waking up at a certain time. They're eating at a certain time. They have, mentors who essentially are with them 24/7 to help them get on track. And I'm so proud of the work I was able to do there. I was with the programs for about 10 years, and we got to change lives. And I believe you really plant seeds because I was 25 when I started that mission.
Wow.
And, I'm in my 30s now. And so my first students are now in their own right parents. They some of them have gotten married, some of them have kids. And so you get to see not just the change in that individual, with social media, you can kind of keep in touch with everyone, but the generational change that now that's going to affect their kids.
That's amazing.
They got better jobs and they finished high school and some went to college. And a lot of people think it's to get them to join the military. And I'll say quickly that it's not. Only about 8% typically join active duty or the military after the program. The program is just designed to give them a second chance.
Yeah.
And so what you probably saw when you Googled it, CBS, followed our students around for about a year to see what it was like before they came into the program, during the program, and what their lives were like after. And our programs always have typically about a 95% success rate for the student, turning their lives around and getting back on track. So it was an honor. That was my greatest mission in the military. It's a blend of my military and educational background. So I was basically a military commandant of a high school.
Wow. Dude, that's pretty amazing. I just wanted to give a shout out for that and that program. I admire that kind of work with, at-risk youth because, that gives people an opportunity to turn their lives around and to get into a place that, really can change their lives, especially if there's a 95% turnaround for those young people. And I think that's amazing. And I'm glad you were able to be a part of that start for that program and to help shape that and the lives of those young people who are now our young adults in our society,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah, the power of teaching, man. It definitely has a longer effect than we sometimes realize in the long run.
Absolutely. You plant seeds, and I say plant seeds because you don't always see the change immediately. Sometimes it's a few months from now before the light bulb goes on. Sometimes it's a few years. Sometimes it might be half a decade or a decade. But you plant those seeds as an educator to help. And I'll say this too because you kind of hit on it when it comes to education and the opportunity to do voiceover. I recently did a documentary for CNN called Dreamland. And I'm so proud of this work as well. It was in conjunction with LeBron James, and we got to tell the story of the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race riots. And for anyone not familiar with it, essentially a town in Tulsa, Oklahoma Black town was completely obliterated. And when I say obliterated, I mean literally, racist white supremacists dropped bombs from airplanes and blew up Black Wall Street, deemed Black Wall Street.
Wow.
And this happened over 100 years ago. And why it's significant is there was a huge cover up. And so people couldn't find the bodies. There was talk that it didn't even exist. And why this touches personally to home, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather is from this region and was a part of this story. And the reason I bring it up is I got to voice a character who was in the documentary sharing his experience because, of course, they've obviously passed on. So they get voice actors to come in so that they're not just reading or putting up on the screen the person's story. So I got to bring the story to life of a character who experienced this firsthand. And in short, he worked so hard and owned properties and, had standing in the community and was giving back. And these people stole everything from him, everything. And it was one of the most powerful things I've gotten to work on in my career. And I'm extremely proud of that work because going back to what you said, it told a story. And I think that's what we get to do as voice actors sometimes is tell the story, not only for ourselves, but for those who can no longer speak, but their voices still need to be heard. And as a African-American man, because, it's a podcast, you can't see me, I'm a black guy. As a black guy, I'm honored to share the story of American history, African-American history in particular. And the reason we tell these stories is so that hopefully the next generation hears them and thinks, that's horrible. That should have never happened.
Yeah.
It will never happen again. So that was an honor to tell that story.
Absolutely. If people don't know history, it will repeat itself. Well, I have 2 final questions for you, and we will wrap this interview up, bud. Are you ready?
Yes. Hit me with it.
All right. So what is the advice you would give to a young aspiring actor who was you 5 or 6 years ago, who is looking at getting into this world of voiceover and specifically acting, but the niche of acting called voiceover?
I love that question because I was that guy 5 years ago. And like I mentioned at the top of the interview, I was fortunate enough to have Alyssa Gentile mentor me. So I would say that ideally you find a mentor, someone who's in the industry. Just like any industry, you want to have a mentor, whether you're laying bricks or teaching college classes or doing law enforcement, whatever it is you're doing, it's ideal to have a mentor. And not just one. That's important too, because you get different perspectives from different people. So finding different mentors in the industry will really help you. So that's my first piece of advice. Definitely find a mentor. But also you have to be prepared. Everyone wants to do this because it seems so cool and all that, but it's a lot harder than it looks. You as an actor stumble on the words and you have to be able to be professional and just pick yourself up and fix it. You definitely need a background in acting. It's called voice acting. And I think a lot of people skip that part because it just seems cool to just read and get paid. But you want to take acting classes. Having a good improv background is really helpful because writers write grammatically correct. So when you read a script, it's written, the way it's supposed to be written. But it's the actor's job to bring the script to life. So as humans, we have natural pauses and stutters and mutters and I'm thinking, because in real life, you don't have a script, right?
Yeah.
So your job as a voice actor, and this is where I had a turning point in my career. When I first started, I was so word perfect. Man, you couldn't tell me nothing. I was going to get every word on the page right. And nobody books that. Like, it doesn't sound natural. It's like robotic, right?
Yeah.
So when I really started booking was when I realized, hey, it's okay to stumble and make mistakes and put your own personality and like, I'm all over the place sometime. And sometime I edit it out because it's too much me. But sometime I always try to leave a little piece of me, even if the character has, nothing to do with me.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think because no one can be you, whoever you are. And that's what's significant. There's an arc in acting where they say, I'm looking for, Tom Hanks who, right? When he started his career, no one knew who Tom Hanks was.
Right.
Tom Hanks who? And then it's like, get me Tom Hanks because he's like the biggest star in the world, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually you reach this point in your career where it's like, get me a Tom Hanks type. Like,
yeah.
So, we all have these arcs in our career where you can't be Tom Hanks because he already exists.
Yeah.
So you had to be yourself, whoever you are. So for me, that's Michael Scott. And yeah, I know it gets confusing with The Office and Steve Carell, but I have to be my own, real Michael Scott when I present myself in this world of acting. So that would be my advice. Study the craft, because if you get the opportunity, and I tell people this all the time, this is probably the best advice I can give, because people always are like, "Oh, can you tell your agent about me? Like get me a meeting with your agent or whatever." And the first thing I say is like, "Okay, do you have a demo?" And they're like, "What?" And so if like already you have no idea what I'm talking about, so what am I going to tell my agent? Like, go check your Instagram, like to go on your Facebook. Like, you have to have stuff, like if the first thing my agent's going to say is, okay, send me their stuff, because they're going to trust I'm not going to send anyone unless it's, someone who's prepared.
Right.
So don't ask for favors until you're ready. And by ready, I mean you've taken classes, you've gotten some experience, you've got a demo, because I can't send your stuff if your stuff doesn't exist. And you have to be willing to invest in the craft. Like, I'm in my own studio now that I built myself, literally by hand. And, it costs a couple $1,000s to put all the equipment and do all the stuff. But you do a few jobs, sometimes one job, and it pays for everything. So you had to be willing to invest money up front for the technology. And not just that, and a lot of people miss this part, you have to know how to use it. Like,
yeah.
So I had to pay someone to train me how to use Uncle Roy, Adobe Audition. So none of these skills that we have are innate in nature. Like, you might have a natural act for acting, right? You might just be a natural, as they say, but most people aren't. You need training on either the technical side, the marketing side, the creative side. There's so much to it, right? So don't be afraid to invest, because there's no way around it.
Absolutely. I think that's amazing advice, and I really appreciate you sharing that. I think it's really deep, it's rooted, and it's heartfelt and true, because if you don't invest in yourself and you don't invest in the craft, you can't get into the world of acting without doing that.
It's so true. And I'll just add, you don't have to start off with like the best stuff. Like
no.
Alyssa told me to get my first microphone, and it cost maybe, I want to say like $200, right?
Yeah.
But the microphone I'm talking to you now costs $2,000. So there's levels to it, like you don't have to start off with the Maserati of studio equipment. Like, it's okay. It's okay to get the Prius. Get it. Work your way up.
I appreciate your advice. I think it is solid. It is really, really good. And I hope a lot of people who are newer to the industry at this point will hear it and learn and grow from your story, much like the ones you listen to and help grow your career in the knowledge base that you gained from my show. So the final question I have for you, are you ready for it?
I'm ready. Hit me with it.
All right, man. The question I have, and I'm sure you know what I'm going to ask because you're an avid listener of the show.
Yes.
Michael, what is the legacy that you want to leave behind?
I want to leave the world better than I found it. And we've talked about some of the things throughout our talk today with, the military and through education. And I talked about, sharing stories of Black history. And I think that's what I really want to do is two things. I want to leave a legacy of fun, playing really fun, big characters, hopefully for Marvel and the Family Guys and the Seth MacFarlanes. Like, my legacy wants to be to make people laugh and to make people learn. If I can do those two things, make you happy and you learn something you didn't know before, I could live with that legacy. So that's my answer in short, because a lot of my answers were probably long-winded, but I'm sure you can edit them down. But yeah, if I can leave a legacy of laughter and learning, I'd be a happy man.
Well, Michael, it has been an absolute honor and pleasure having you on the show today. Would you just give us a closeout today before we go?
So if you want to follow more of my shenanigans, you can find me at Michael Scott Action on most platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Michael Scott Action. My stage name is actually Real Michael Scott, because I wanted to keep my actual name, but I had to throw something in there to SAG wants everyone to have a separate name. But that's where you can follow me. And it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm Michael Scott, and this is Who Did That Voice?
Hey everyone, and thanks so much for listening to today's episode of Who Did That Voice? If you enjoyed today's episode, please check us out online on all social media platforms at Who Did That Voice and on YouTube at Who Did That Voice 24. Also, remember to check out our website, whodidthatvoice.org. Again, that's www.whodidthatvoice.org. Thank you to all my listeners out there. I just wanted to say, if you want to partner with Who Did That Voice, just telling your friends and family about us is the best way to share the show with others. And or leaving us a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcast from. The third and final way is by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/Who Did That Voice.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time for more discoveries on Who Did That Voice.